Since its humble beginnings, mountain biking has become a global phenomenon. To millions of cyclists, these bikes are more than a form of recreation. They're a way of life. The question of who actually invented the mountain bike is steeped in myth and legend, but certain facts are undeniable. It is widely accepted that the epicenter of the mountain bike movement was in Northern California's Marin County. Here, in the 1970s, a few dozen hardcore cyclists took to the hills in a collaborative effort that by the end of the decade would become the modern mountain bike. Their shared passion and obsessive tinkering led to the birth of a multi-billion-dollar industry, a form of recreation for the masses, and an Olympic sport. Some of these athletes were serious road racers with dreams of Olympic glory, while others were counterculture types. With little in common, except for their love of pre-World War II newsboy bicycles, these two tribes rode down the mountain that towered over the small towns where they grew up.
We had our own thing going on here.
For us, the mountain bike thing was freeing.
It was like flying.
It was this small group of riders who quite literally reinvented the wheel. Their innovations made some of them wealthy, some of them wise, and all of them proud to have made a meaningful contribution to society. They had no idea that they were creating a worldwide sensation.
It was this party out in the woods.
These are the Klunkerz of Marin County. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, San Francisco was the vortex of America's counterculture movement. Much of what was happening in the city spilled over the Golden Gate Bridge and into Marin County.
Marin culture was, back in the 70s, it was Haight-Ashbury North.
There's a lot of hashish smoking and intense bike riding and, all this rock and roll gigs going all over the place, and it was a righteous scene.
While many of the kids here were expanding their minds with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, others were expanding the possibilities of what could be done on old fat-tired bicycles, often risking life and limb to do so.
Who wants to pedal a bike uphill? The fun's going downhill.
And we were just good at going downhill.
Some of these cyclists were Category 1 road racers, looking for a new way to train during the off-season.
I was a weird anomaly in that I was a racer, a real racer, that was into this thing.
I rode road bikes 200, 300, 400 miles a week training for races.
Others were fun-loving hippies who enjoyed being close to nature.
It was obvious. We were a group of stupid hippies turning the world on its ear, the whole bike world.
Marin County is a magical place. Nestled between the Pacific Ocean and the San Francisco Bay, it's surrounded by natural beauty. With thick forests, rolling hills, and charming towns in between, it's the crown jewel of the Bay Area. And in the center of it all stands Mount Tamalpais. Affectionately known as Mount Tam, the mountain soars nearly 2,600 feet above sea level. It's the most famous mountain in mountain biking.
We had all hiked Tam. Obviously, if you grew up around here, Mount Tam, I always have lived in a house that's had a view of Mount Tam.
We used to ride our bikes all the way from the very top of the mountain, all the way down here, come down this trail, and this is where we'd end up. We'd be at home. 1 block away is our houses.
I had been hiking on Mount Tam since I was 5 years old up to the top.
I, for years, had ridden around the periphery of all these things when right in the center was just the heart of some great cycling. This is what makes this place hot, and we had the golden key.
It was beautiful, it's just, you couldn't get any better.
There were 3 groups of cyclists that used Mount Tam and the surrounding area as their proving ground. They collectively pushed the boundaries of where one could go and what one could do on an old balloon tire bike.
It was Larkspur Canyon Gang. It was like a few people in Fairfax, a few people in Mill Valley that would ride off-road.
A number of us from Mill Valley from a very early age would ride up to the top of Mount Tam. And on the flip side of that, we rode down and became very good at riding down too. We really had those handling skills around those tight, twisty corners on Panoramic Highway.
We had our own thing going on here in Fairfax and San Anselmo. These guys in Mill Valley,
When you were that young, it was like a world away. I mean, Fairfax might as well have been 1,000 miles away.
they were on their own different planet, okay?
We went up to the mountain on the west side. I was a Mill Valley West Side kid, and we would ride our whole area, which included all of Mill Valley, Mount Tam up to the top.
We had a scene going here.
It was a very funny situation when it started because in Fairfax, we would go out on rides. We'd go up on the hills and we'd go riding all over the place. But no matter how far we went in the hills and how many trails we went on, at the end of the ride, we'd come back into Fairfax and ride through town. And people would see us and they'd say, "That looks like fun riding through town on a fat-tired bike, you know?"
And anybody, even when I first started the fire department, these guys that knew nothing about bicycles, care less about bicycles, you put anybody on one of these single-speed bikes and they're having fun.
So what was so great about these pre-World War II newsboy bikes anyway?
For years we're racing on the road, traveling all over, the western United States, sometime traveling back east. And myself and Joe were always into bicycles. Another guy that was on the team, Mark Vendetti, was also into bicycles.
And we stopped by Mark's house, and he had one of these old balloon tire bikes that he had been riding on Mount Tam a few years earlier. And he pumped up the tire and put some oil in the change. He said, "Joe, take it for a little spin up the street," and I did. And I was surprised. I really liked it. It was unlike road cycling. Yeah, you have football and you have ballet, and they're different, and they both can be great.
We started riding these old single-speed bikes, usually 40 Schwinn's, because they had the high bottom bracket.
What we called an Excelsior-type ballooner, or I called them ballooners. There was no name, we called them ballooners or
Cruisers.
beater bikes, bombers.
Cruiser bikes, bombers, beaters, cruisers, ballooners, clunkers. Cruiser bike that you'd ride around town.
My ballooner.
Clunkers with a K.
Clunkers,
I think.
They really were clunkers. They were, they were only strong because of their mass, they were just beasts. But they were fun. They were really soulful. They just exuded this soul. There was this patina of time on them, of course, because they were old, from the 1930s and 40s. You could imagine some kid using them on their paper route or something. And they were just really fun to ride in a very different way than road racing bikes. And we would take them up on Mount Tam and ride them on the trails and have a great time.
But who was the first to start riding these old clunker bikes out in the woods?
The first off-road racing scene I'd ever heard of was a Larkspur Canyon gang.
Who were taking these old fat tire bikes from the 1930s and 40s up on Mount Tamalpais and
race from the top of Tam into Larkspur Canyon, any route you want, for a bag of pot.
The guys in the Canyon gang, they're just kind of like a bunch of stoner recreation seekers, and downhilling was something they were onto it long before we were,
As far as anyone can tell, the two-wheeled invasion of Mount Tam began with a group of kids from Larkspur, known as the Larkspur Canyon Gang.
We consider the canyon our playground. We used to hang out up here. This was our backyard. This is our playground up here. We'd spend weekends up here after school hours.
We grew up together here in these woods.
Did all the usual pre-teenage and teenage stuff, crazy stuff, keg parties and carrying on.
Just like to go up and ride around in the woods, have a good time.
1968, I think, would be the pivotal year. We were all in grammar school together, last year grammar school, and we were building trails and forts up here.
This here trail goes up to Mount Tam. We built this. It was built by bicycles coming down here, the whole path.
They had the fire trail here originally, and we made all the trails going up to the other fire trails for shortcuts. Instead of, going all the way around, we made little trails.
We'd ride up the canyon right here, Madrone Canyon, and we'd push up this trail because we had these big old heavy bikes, so we'd just push them up what we call S Trail, and we'd ride down to Lake Lagunitas. And that was pretty much an all-day ride at the time.
We were adventurous. We did a lot of crazy stuff. We were all kind of adrenaline junkies. That was the one bond we had. We loved getting high off, doing crazy stuff. And riding our bikes down Mount Tam was a total rush. The problem at the time was the bicycles, they weren't suited for the mountain. So you'd spend a couple hours shoving these bikes up there, and the day would be a bummer because you'd go a quarter of a mile and you'd have two flat tires and a bent rim,
And we never carried pumps or patch kits or anything. If you got a flat, you were either pushing or riding a flat, or some people would actually kind of pop the tire off and you'd pack Scotch broom or something in there to get you home.
So we started looking to the heavy frame bikes like our brothers used to ride, and they were still around. You could get them in the junkyards and the dump and, secondhand stores. We'd take these bikes, we'd cut the fenders off, cut the chain guard off, cut off the useless kickstand, take off the tank if it had one, and you had a clunker. And with these bikes, you could ride all day. And what we learned is the heavier and stronger the bike was, you could start going places that up to that time people simply didn't ride before.
Everybody was always saying they were the fastest down the mountain. Who could ride their bike fastest down the mountain?
We had one major event, one major crazy bike ride down the mountain in 1971.
I think about the first corner or third corner I went around, I was going too fast and went right off the cliff. And then at the bottom we had all the girls meet at the bottom with the truck, and we had a keg of beer. I think we had snow from the Sierras keeping the beer cold.
Yeah. What was the prize? What was the prize supposed to be?
Oh, I think I put up something for the winner, some smokables.
That was the one memorable race we had.
It was such a gas, I'll tell you. It was a good old time.
Eventually, the thrill of riding down Mount Tam faded.
By the mid-'70s, we started weaning away from bicycles and got more into the trucks and cars.
The Canyon Gang's tracks disappeared from the mountain around 1974.
It was a magical time, and we were very lucky to be part of it.
Their contributions were Marin's first link in the evolution of the modern mountain bike. Meanwhile, in Fairfax and Mill Valley, road riding was where it was at. In the early 70s, road racing was regarded as a straight-laced sport. Being children of the 60s, the Marin riders were nonconformists, and so they decided to form their own outlaw road racing club.
There were a lot of us young upstarts getting into road racing, and we thought, hey, we should have a club, and we formed Velo Club Tamalpais.
Founded in 1972 by Stevie Wild and Gil De La Rosa, VCT was Marin's alternative race club.
Velo Club Tam started in, I believe it was 1972.
It was 72, 73. It was when there were gas wars. People had to wait in line in their automobiles, and people on bikes would ride by and just thumb their noses. It was Earth Day. It was the energy crisis. Oh my God, we were going to change the world.
This is when Gary kind of started re-racing on the road again. He got thrown out of cycling there for a little while for smoking combustibles and just different politics and stuff and having long hair. And he kind of got back into racing and started riding with Breeze and myself and different folks around the county. And we kind of decided to start our own club.
And it was a reaction to the other bike club in Marin County, the Marin Cyclists, which we saw as somewhat stuffy. We were kind of the other element of the cycling community, and they didn't really want much to do with us, and we didn't see anything that, we wanted to do with them, so we just formed our own bike club.
These were the guys that were different, gonna do it different. The new, young, hot racers and everything.
The idea was to be a regular 10-speed race club.
The hot racers in VC Tam were Joe and Richard Breeze, Mark Vendetti, myself, Otis Guy.
Those three guys were probably our best racers in the club, Otis and Joe and Gary.
Gary was a Class 1 road racer, and he was a very serious road bike racer, as was Joe Breeze.
Joey, in fact, got to be in the top 10 on the road one year in the country. Whenever the national championships, Joe got to be in the top 10, and Gary, I think, was 14th. And so we had some really good riders. They're in the top 15 in the whole country, 3 guys from our little bike club in NorCal. So that was a powerhouse club.
One rider who came into Velo Club Tamalpais was Mark Vendetti, who had previously ridden with the Canyon Gang in Larkspur. He started showing up at the VCT meetings on his old clunker bike. The rest of the club couldn't help but notice. Mark's bike was such a radical departure from the lightweight European road bikes they rode day in and day out.
It turned out he had been riding a bike like this on Mount Tam a few years earlier with when he lived in Larkspur and rode with the Canyonites or the Canyon Gang. And he was kind of the crossover guy, Mark was.
He was a big influence as far as the guys in the club starting to ride clunker bikes.
Mark Vendetti came to Velo Club Tam with that knowledge of this other side of cycling and infected us there. We were all the skinny tire, drop handlebar road racing guys, but there lurked in Mark's brain this knowledge of another way to ride a bike.
Velo Club Tamalpais used to have meetings in the Robeson Harrington Mansion, and that's here in San Anselmo.
I would ride up from Mill Valley, and people would generally ride their bikes to the meetings at night. And Mark started riding his, and Otis started riding his down there. And
pretty soon everybody in the club was coming to the meetings on their clunker bikes because the meetings are at night, and you don't ride your Italian bike at night in the streets. So
we were all exchanging ideas about these new bikes, and it was this whole other sideline. We were still road racing at the time. In the spring and summer months, we would do a lot of road racing, and then in the fall, when the road races would stop, we would do this fat tire riding on the mountain and just having a ball. And it really got all this bike-crazed younger bicyclists together in a big way, and we met every month and just really shared our enthusiasm for this wonderful way of getting around in our day-to-day lives and having fun on the weekend and at races and really enjoying life. And that enthusiasm was really what led to the mountain bike.
And so now here we got to investigate Mount Tam, on these great bikes.
We first started riding the trails and exploring parts of the watershed district that I'd never been in before, and was discovering that it was a lot of fun.
The rides were almost always hosted by Fred Wolf, who was Charlie Kelly's best friend.
Fred Wolf lived right up on the edge of the trails there, and he said, well, why don't you guys take your bikes out on the trail here?
In the beginning, in the 70s, there were no rules because the authorities didn't know about us. There was no speed limit. There were no rules about not riding on single-track trails. It was wide open.
Before trails were closed down, we could just about have our run of anywhere.
And back then, in the early days, we were so privileged, and we just had the whole run of the mountain. We could literally ride all day without seeing a human being. And we had all the single track, all to ourselves.
I go out and ride my road bike. Okay, I go out training in the morning. I start at 7 in the morning, 8 in the morning, come back at 1 in the afternoon, rest up. Fred Wolf would call me up and say, hey man, you want to go on a clunk? And he'd be going on an afternoon clunk or something, and we'd go out for 3 or 4 hours, and it was a completely different scene of people. I'd take off all the cycling clothes and I put on my Levi's, because it just wasn't cool to show up in cycling clothes, because we were going to go out and have some fun and just goof around.
Our first ride, Gary and Fred and I went on this ride, but we only had 2 bikes. So here's how tough we were. One guy would run, the other 2 guys would ride, and then we'd switch.
My first ride was just incredibly painful. I'm surprised that I even managed to make it a mile, which is probably what I rode, and back without falling over the side of the cliff. It was a harrowing experience, and I'm surprised I actually got back on a bike, but I was hooked. From then on, it was every day. I once rode 76 days in a row. I was so charged up. I was just jacked.
I always said that the 3 biggest hazards of bicycle riding were cars, cops, and pavement. And out in the hills, you eliminate all 3 of those.
We're doing all these trails at that time. There were very, very, very few trail signs.
My favorite thing about cycling is riding trails.
The earliest days, people thought we were nuts when they'd see us riding bikes in the trails. They thought, what are you guys doing up here? How'd you get up here?
For me, it was a way to get out and go to the lake or go to a stream or go abalone diving.
Not down a trail, but down a trail. It's just a beautiful experience.
You develop an appreciation of the outdoors when you do that.
It was so healthy and so positive. The interaction you have with nature.
And it was so much fun because, you go fast up the hill and everything, you'd hang out, you'd wait for other people to show up. You'd talk, you bullshit, you do whatever you do, and you come blazing down the hill. And it was, this party out in the woods.
And it'd be like a rolling picnic. We'd go on these various rides that Fred thought up, and it was always a lot of fun, and it took almost all day, and you'd end up someplace with frisbees and dogs and stuff to eat and having a picnic, and then come down something really steep on the way home, and it was fun.
It was just a blast, total blast.
It still has a sort of, tribe to the whole thing, that we're a group that we all cling together. It doesn't matter who you are. If you have a mountain bike, you see another mountain biker, it's just thumbs up. It's just, there's a brotherhood, a sisterhood of it all. It's a family. It's a great thing.
And it amazed me because, I was used to the world of athleticism and people being fast or not fast and all the egos and all that sort of thing. And this was an absolute radical departure from that. It was like the extended family. To get out and have a great time with friends at just all hours of the day and night.
Their rolling party had a killer soundtrack. They were surrounded by the San Francisco music scene, and they were into it.
See, all these people came out of the 70s around here musically, and the music scene was a really big deal. Every band had a family, and there was 100 to 200 people in these families. That would be extended friends of friends of friends who always came to the parties, and it was always these big circles of people.
I started a light show when I was a senior in high school. We did the Grateful Dead a few times. We did Big Brother and the Holding Company.
So we're plonked right in the middle of that, hanging out, chasing around with these rock and rollers and having fun.
Charlie Kelly was a roadie for the Sons of Champlain. Well, the Sons of Champlain were really big in Marin as far as having a family of people and entourage and people that threw parties for them. And some of the best parties I ever went to were Sons parties.
When I met Charlie and Gary, Gary had worked at Laser Light Shows, and they actually knew the guys, some of the guys from the Grateful Dead. Bob Weir had a mountain bike later on.
I was hanging out in the hate somewhat. That's how I met Charlie, was through the music scene. Interesting, all these musicians in fat tire riding.
And so, it was always kind of connected to music and, and fun and counterculture and so forth, the 60s stuff that we were all raised with.
So it was very much kind of circle of friends, family-oriented kind of a clique thing that was going on, so.
Riding mountain bikes started to really branch out.
After a while, there became annual events, and one of the first of those was the Appetite Seminar.
Which is an annual ritual to burn off some calories while all the women folk cook a nice big dinner at home.
And Thanksgiving of 1974 was the first date that I know about where Fred Wolf, who had this big old pink dump truck, and Charlie Kelly and Gary and the Craigs, Larry and Wendy, and a bunch of other Fairfax people threw their bike in the back of the truck, and he'd drive up to the top of Pine Mountain and do this Pine Mountain loop, which is 20 miles in the dirt.
Every time we'd see a guy flying along on a great big bike with his arms out like this and a big flannel shirt flapping, he'd go, there, that must be another seminarian. And I wasn't getting it. Like, what's this Appetite Seminar? That doesn't look like a priest to me.
Word got out, and there must have been 40, 50 people there.
Fred put on a huge Thanksgiving dinner.
I remember a hell of an appetite.
But as the Marin riders ventured further and further out on the trails, they soon discovered their stock newsboy bikes weren't made to take that kind of punishment. So with a little homespun ingenuity, they began modifying them with parts scavenged from old bike shops, junkyards, and even adapting parts from old motorcycles.
When we were first riding these fat tire bikes, we had to do some modifications to them.
Being on Mount Tam, you rode every day, and then you'd break stuff, and you'd go, well, that didn't work, and got to figure something else out, and you'd be back at it again. And so the thing evolved through need, through trying to develop something that was going to work and last.
We had to get the heavy stuff because people were breaking cranks, busting stuff, and especially Charlie and Fred, because those guys are both over 200 pounds. They spent all their time moving equipment for the Sons of Champlain,
We were always trying different things and different parts, and since I was one of the heavier, bigger guys and reckless, and I broke a lot of stuff, people were always wanting me to try this out, see if this works.
I mean, the first innovation was first getting bikes at higher bottom brackets, and those were pre-war, from before 1945, and usually like around 41, 42 Schwinn's. Schwinn's were the strongest frames.
They were strong, but I don't think Schwinn designers were really thinking about us when they designed those early fat tire bikes.
Joe, Tom Ritchie, myself, we all used Schwinn Excelsior X geometry. That was like sort of the holy grail of geometry. And we didn't want to mess with that until we had explored other areas.
Meanwhile, the old frames were breaking. The forks would break. They'd start snapping and cracking. You're out there in the boonies, man. It's a problem.
I had a whole front end come off me on one ride, and the bike just split right in half.
We kind of found out by trial and error. For instance, the front axles aren't strong enough. It's a little frightening to learn this way, but after a few of us went sailing over the handlebars, it's amazing how fast a bike can drop out from underneath you on the front end when the front axle breaks. Those forks go down to the earth and splay right out, and you go flying.
To ride a clunk Well, you have no front brake. Therefore, you have to develop this art where you turn the bike sideways as you're skidding the rear wheel. That's how you could slow fast enough. If you went straight down something and just skidded the rear wheel, you were a goner. You would not be able to stop at all because there was no front brake. So the steel-toed boot helped quite a bit because you'd, from time to time, you'd have to kick rocks out of the way when you're doing this.
You go out and ride it and you realize how basically they're brakeless bikes. The brakes don't even work.
And of course, there were no gears, so you couldn't climb anything. We would spend about 80% of the time just getting up things.
It was obvious we needed new technology. And what we did was we would scavenge the bike shops, because we were working the bike shops for the bike race, getting prizes and promoting it, doing this stuff for the bike race. So it was a pretty easy thing to go around to all the different shops.
In the 70s, there were still plenty of bicycle shops everywhere with old men that had been running them since the 30s or the 20s. And you could go in there and find old parts, buy old parts.
Early on, we used to do this thing. We'd go on sort of scavenger hunts, right? And people would have secret shops to go to. And I got very good at finding these places and invading their stashes. And somebody would go there, another one of these guys afterwards, and I'd go to the same place, and man, everything would be gone. I'd say, who the f was here? Well, Fisher, kid, like that.
But keeping your bike in top condition is only the beginning. You should check your bike to see that everything is in good condition. If you don't know how to check your bike, get a bike mechanic to help you.
Ground zero for wrenching on old clunker bikes was 32 Humboldt Avenue.
Charlie says, hey man, I'm looking for a roommate. Really? Cool, let's do it. Humboldt Avenue, right above the church. The church was, where the sons would practice.
And that house had a dining room in it, really big dining room in it. And instead of a table in that dining room, hey, we just workbench bolted to the wall, nails into the wall of the floor, We didn't eat there, we ate standing up in the kitchen, come on. What, cook? Us? And get a burrito, man.
Alan Bonds was our roommate.
By August of '76, I had moved in with Gary and Charlie. And that's when, seems to me like everything just kind of took off.
What a scene. It was going on all the time.
As we stripped down old Schwinn frames, and took the stuff that you didn't use, which is everything with the frame, what you got is piles of old cranks and hubs and wheels and stuff. Well, that stuff would all just get hung out as decorations out on the porch.
There's porch around it, or porch along the side of it, and it was just everywhere you looked was chock full of bike stuff.
Girls didn't understand what they were seeing when they came in here, because it was testosterone-rich environment, shall we say.
What a perfect roommate scene.
3 bachelors, lots of bikes.
The communal spirit of the times dictated that they share their new discoveries. This process of continual modification, each riffing off each other's innovations, was a critical factor in the evolution of the modern mountain bike.
And so there would be people who would be building up these bikes for people, Alan Bonds and Gary Fisher built some bikes up for people. Many of us built bikes up for people. I built bikes up for my friends down in Mill Valley.
In the beginning, it was part scavenger hunt and part black art. There were only a few people that knew how to do it. Alan was one of those early practitioners.
Alan was really, even before me and Gary, he took on the task of if somebody wanted a cruiser, a Marin County clunker, and was not themselves capable of putting one together, Alan would do it, because it was kind of an arcane collection of skills and things you had to know to put one of these bikes together, because the stuff was not made to fit, and you had to file things and bend them and go out and find adapters and
taking an old frame and spreading the rear end, mounting a derailleur, attaching all the cables to it and that sort of thing to do this sort of mongrel setup.
This is my 1953 Spitfire. It's the second bike that Gary Fisher built as a hybrid, and there's nothing fancy about it. Just it's a straightaway old balloon tire bicycle, newsboy bicycle.
Clunker bikes would be put to a new kind of test in the next event, a cyclocross race.
Cyclocross was around when I was growing up in the cycling thing. I rode my first cyclocross race in '65.
The cyclocross racing is a form of road racing that's specifically for the dirt. There's sculpted tires and more mud clearance and things like that. It's a European sport.
It's very intensive. You know, you'd ride very, very hard in one of those races, where mountain biking is like, hey, we're going to spend like 6 hours out here goofing around. You know, the sort of intensity you can do in a cyclocross race, you cannot do on a mountain bike for very long.
1974, a friend of mine put on a cyclocross event in Mill Valley.
And there were these guys who showed up from out of our area, from out of Marin County.
My name is Russ Mahon.
And they were a lot like us, bunch of hippie off-roaders.
We enjoyed some of the same fun that Marin County lads did.
But it was the things that they added to their bikes that made them truly different.
They had balloon tire bikes that they had grafted derailleurs onto and a few motorcycle parts.
They were a year ahead of us. They had the gears on their bikes, they had front brakes on their bikes.
First discovered the capabilities of the Morrow coaster brake, 72. Found it in a dumpster in Alviso down by San Jose. So we started with the Morrow and discovered immediately that it outlasted everything else. Bendix, New Departure, Muscle Man, nothing was in the same category.
He had that front drum and a Morrow in the back, and that was, you know, that was where it was at.
Amazing, yeah.
Everybody just had to have those at that point. It was, that was the hub of choice.
The mechanical advantages of the transmission were there. It was obvious.
Before we had the single speeds, and you got a big front sprocket and one speed, there's stuff you just can't go up. But when you have, you know, throw a few gears on there, then you have a much better range, and you can kind of, you know, ride and you know, you can just get further.
The Morrow Dirt Club discovering the cyclocross race in Mill Valley is still a mystery. Reflecting upon it now, probably the only way we would have ever known about that would be a notice on the window of a bicycle shop at Cupertino Bike Shop. Just can't think of any other way we would have known. It wasn't our bread and butter. That seemed like a good idea to introduce the bikes.
And we showed up to this cyclocross race, and here these guys are on, you know, the bicycles that we ride, but with gears on them. And it was like, that's a good idea. And, you know, after we saw those things at that race, you know, we started putting gears on the bikes. And that was, you know, the first time Gary saw gears on a mountain bike, and that's kind of got, you know, him way jacked up.
I didn't notice them. I was busy racing. And that's like Joe's big cornerstone of like, we have photos of you there looking at their bikes.
I'm sure that was one of the inspirations for Gary to put the gears on his bike.
I remember the day of the race, too. We were just sitting there, and a group of guys came over and started going, hey, what do you got there? You know, hey, you're going to race those? Or, oh, yeah, you know. And it was just really interesting to see some of the interest from the crowd and the other racers, you know, looking at our gear and going, oh, okay.
I saw them that day, and I talked to them. And I was impressed with these bikes, that they were the most advanced off-road bike that I had seen to date. Really what set them apart. I think Gary had derailleurs on his bike at the time, maybe even front and rear. He had these stem shifters mounted on the handlebar, where these guys had the thumb shifters. And more than anything, I was just impressed that there was somebody outside our area who was doing this.
To sum it up, I would say the vibration from the athletes at the Marin race was nice bike, but you're gonna die out here.
Well, I was strolling on that filthy avenue, kicking around, wondering what...
Then they just disappeared. We never heard from them again, and Charlie would say, Joe, who were those guys?
Who were those guys, you know?
And so we tried to look into it, but they were unconnected to the bicycle industry, and we had called a lot of shops in the South Bay, and they just vanished.
The mysterious disappearance of the Morrow Dirt Club, so often spoke about in literature, was 2 years after the Marin race. I imagine this is the same in bike clubs everywhere. Things get together, things happen for a while, and people move on.
We weren't out to make a whole movement or a whole wave. It was for us and anybody that that showed an interest in it, you know.
With dirt clubs splitting up, the rotating mass, so well represented by Marin, was lost.
It may have been the Morrow Dirt Club that was the first to add gears and front brakes to their fat-tired clunkers, but it was the Marin riders who took these modifications even further down the trail.
What's important about what happened here in Marin is just that there was this vein of off-road biking, this fat tire way that became mountain biking, and really it was the depth of the interest, the number of people doing what we were doing in Marin County, even with attrition. that it kept growing and growing to the point that it actually spilled out of our county and caught the nation's attention. And that's really what's important about what happened in Marin. We reached at this certain critical mass. A whole lot more people were getting onto these fat tire bikes. They're getting them from Gary Fisher and Charlie Kelly and Alan Bonds and us bike types that were putting them together for people. And doing all these rides out in West Marin and on Mount Tam and Point Reyes. And somewhere along the line, you get some competitive types together. And somebody's going to say, well, I'm fastest.
I'm faster than you are.
You know, somebody else would say, well, no, you're not. You're not as fast as I am. Who is the fastest?
I beat Joe every time it ever counted.
So one thing leads to another, and you find a good downhill to prove it.
So we came up with the idea of running a time trial, see once and for all which of the 8 or 9 of us was the fastest guy in the downhill.
Too much speed makes your bike harder to control and is especially dangerous when riding down a steep hill.
Well, Repack was the first official race course for us.
Fred Wolf was the person who found the course.
Repack itself was one of the roads that I had never explored in my truck or my motorcycle because there was no access from the bottom because of all the gates. But riding around, we had seen the bottom of Repack, so we knew it was a hill that came down from somewhere.
We put on that event, and that was October of '76.
There was only 7 people in the first race, and somehow or another I ended up winning it. And so immediately they had to have another race to make sure that didn't go on much longer. So the next week they had a second race, and Bob Burrows won it, so then it was okay. Everything was fine.
We thought, well, okay, Bob's the winner. That decides that. Well, Alan said, wait a minute, I fell down. If I hadn't fallen down, come on, I'm kicking Bob's ass. And Fred said, what chain fell off? You know, whatever the excuse is, I just need one more shot at that guy. And we held our second event just 4 days later. Once again, you know, it didn't decide anything except that week.
The first competition for me off-road was Repack, you know, and regrettably, too. It's like it scared the living crap out of me. The whole concept of, you know, racing downhill.
That's 2 miles downhill and about a 1,400 foot drop.
And it's steep out on the fire road. It's not trail work we're talking. This is fire road, you know, going as fast as you can.
And it wasn't fun to go down Repack. I mean, it's never been fun. It's always been a little bit scary. And especially if you just want to go slow, because you can't go slow down Repack. You have to let go.
At the start line, I was so terrified. I could barely turn the pedals. I was so scared. I was just like this great big bowl of jello, you know. It was hairball.
We have like a party up on the top. I mean, everybody's all excited. You're nervous. You're ready to go.
A lot of competition, a lot of gun-ho, kind of, let's get this thing going, you know, because I'm going to beat your butt.
Being a competitor back then and going downhill fast and letting it all hang out, you know, that was just another dimension of competition to me, and thinking who's the baddest down the hill. You know, to me, it was like in road racing, who was the baddest up the hill. So it was, you know, your skills just pitted against other people in a different way.
By golly, by the time you got to the bottom of it, your coaster brake hub would have had its grease heated up so much that it had blown out the back and vaporized into this contrail of smoke.
That sucker would get so hot that you would have to go take it apart, repack it with grease, because there would be no grease. The thing would just howl.
It was smoking. All the grease had vaporized and burned up from heat and friction.
And so we had to go home and repack our hubs, and that's where the name of the race came from, Repack.
I crashed so hard that I didn't want to move right away to find out what was broken, you know. Man, I just thought, man, I just wonder if I just broke my pelvis, you know. I mean, I slammed so hard.
The most memorable runs were the runs where you didn't crash. And you actually got to do the whole thing without getting hurt.
I mean, it was like a 2-mile drop, vertical drop straight down, laden with cavernous holes and huge rocks and hairball turns and all these places that you could drop into them and never be seen again. You know, it was scary, really scary.
I laid on the road for a while. I thought, man, I just don't want to, wait a minute. There's gonna be a guy coming down this hill in about 2 minutes here, and if I'm laying here, he's riding right over me. So probably a good idea to move.
I do remember the crashes probably better than the runs where I didn't crash.
You know, when you crash on a road bike, you're sliding along the street on your hip or something. You're just kind of like road rash. Whereas in the dirt, even though the dirt was technically softer, there was these rocks out there. And guys would hit trees and stuff because they couldn't maybe miss the corner and go flying off the hit the tree. I mean, and a lot of guys crash bad.
I remember hitting a tree really hard one time and planting my sunglasses into the bridge of my nose. I still got the scar there.
The worst kind of wipeouts is a high side, where the rear wheel slides out and then catches, and you're sideways when it catches, and it just flips you down the road. Yeah, body slams. You just...
You just go around these smooth corners and just fly. I mean, just there was dirt everywhere.
Dirt flying, guys would be laying it down at the finish line. I mean, this is a blast.
We used to hide first aid kits and splints behind the trees in case somebody got hurt. We'd have some sort of first aid equipment to take care of them. So we cared about everybody that raced and everybody involved. It was a good time.
Of these 25 repack races, I managed to win 10 of them and had the second fastest time. Gary Fisher will always have the fastest time on repack for eternity.
Best time was, I think, 4:24 or 4:25. Gary's the fastest time, 4:22, and then Joe was the second fastest, and I was the third fastest of all time.
And Joe Breves was right in there. They were dicing it out. Joe and Gary were very competitive. Still are.
And every time they ever raced against each other, no matter whether the course was off a few seconds from its optimum, their times always differed by 1 second.
Gary set a really scorching record. That 4:22 is really fast.
I always thought that I was the fastest guy because I'd get out in front and I wouldn't let people pass me. But once we had these races, that's when I learned I wasn't the fastest one. I think my best time was 4:34. Gary Fisher's was 4:22.
My fastest standing start would be like 4:39, and my fastest rolling start was at 4:28.
Bob Burrows, his fastest time was 4:37, and every time we raced, I beat him by 2 or 3 seconds. He got pretty upset about that.
So we're all within 10, 15 seconds of the record.
There was no competition between riders. It was great to improve your own time by 3 or 4 seconds. You know, that was really magical. That's where personal best was started, you know. Well, it's not his time you're trying to beat, it's your last time you're trying to beat.
When repack first started, it was pretty much had to do with the timing, because it's basically just a downhill course, and you had to know what time the person left and then what time he finished the finish line.
Charlie would always be the starter of repack.
I don't think that what we did was at all unusual until we started putting a clock on it. Fred and I bought the very first generation of digital stopwatches. And a lot of people race their bikes against each other downhill, and I would be very surprised if, you know, those Schwinn's weren't raced downhill in the 30s, you know. But when you put the clock on it, it changes everything.
You know, Charlie is a genius at the timing stuff and really did a fantastic job on that. And sacrificing in a sense, he wanted to do the race too a lot, but he kind of sacrificed his own goals or whatever to really get that thing going and get it timed and everything.
I would help Charlie time. I would help Charlie call people up. I'd help Charlie hustle prizes for that. It's still Charlie's race, He did it.
The finish line was like a big party.
There'd be a keg of beer at the bottom and a lot of party-type atmosphere. And I think most of that was because we actually got to the bottom without killing ourselves. That feeling of the anxiety's gone, and we lived to tell about it.
Wendy was way, way, way ahead of her time. I mean, Wendy was the only girl in a lot of stuff, and I'm sure glad she came along because she was the only one that brought a camera.
So I had my camera on my back. Every single ride I ever went on, I had my camera. So I'd just break it out and start snapping away. I was just doing it for fun, and I didn't even have a clue that I was recording history and the history makers. It's a real honor to know that, I captured that moment.
Wendy was really, really an integral part of the whole deal. I started organizing them, and eventually, and the Larkspur guys started coming over. And
holy Toledo! Everybody knew about it in town, and you had to beat these guys from Mill Valley. It was insane. I mean, I'd go through town, and people would say, "Gary, gonna ride?" So it was a matter of civic pride to have to ride that thing.
Then the Berkeley guys heard about it. Man, within a month or month and a half of our first race, we had a real regional competition was going on, but the Fairfax guys were ahead of everybody because we were maybe a few months ahead technologically.
What's really so important about Repack is that it got everybody together on a regular basis to share enthusiasm for this fat tire bike and sharing ideas about where it might go. And that's what really pushed mountain biking to the next level, because it spilled it out of Marin County.
And at that point, the arms race started. To find some technological advantage over these other guys, well, maybe he can ride faster, but I have better brakes. Maybe I can get a better time, you know? And so everybody started looking for that technological edge.
I'm going to have the coolest bike, you know? You guys think you got cool bikes? I'm going to have the coolest bike, you know? And that was the motivation back then.
We started to evolve with adding gears and adding front brakes.
Super strong brakes, you know, stuff that you had total confidence in. The brakes that I used were tandem drum brakes. The brake cables that I used were motorcycle cables, and the levers I used were motorcycle brake levers. This made a tremendous brake that you could ride again and again and not have to worry about. They'd never fade.
The demands on the brakes were much more severe than they were for a road bike, and this was aggravated by the fact that in loose surfaces you had to do almost all your braking with your rear wheel, because once the front wheel began to slip and slide, the likelihood was very high you're going to end up on the ground.
Because sometimes the brakes would go bad on the back, especially those coaster brakes. So to get down, you'd have to take your vibram-sole boot and jam it against the front tire to slow down, because you didn't have any brakes.
Later on, you know, we put Schwinn-made strap-on cantilevers, and we put strap-on cantilevers in the front fork, so we had a little bit of a front brake.
Cantilever brakes were the way to go until somebody invented something a lot better. And of course, now you can get hydraulic brakes and disc brakes. But we all knew that brakes mattered.
So that's where front brakes began, and then
The only problem was not being able to pedal up the hills with the 1-speeds. It was pretty tough. So the 5-speed, 10-speed concept made it available to get into these areas. And that's when all the fun began.
You know, a multi-gear bike just totally made sense, you know, out of a fat tire bike. And to have something with ultra-wide gear ratios was the ticket.
And Gary found a disassembled tandem, built the wheel with it, you know, and put it on his bike, and we went for a ride. And Gary, on his 50-pound bike, just rode away from the rest of us, you know, on this long climb. And we just go, wow, got to have him.
Fred was the guy that wanted to be able to climb things. He was the one that really championed putting lower and lower gears on and stuff that would work and last.
when the gears got lower and lower, and then the limiting factor as to how steep a hill you could ride up was if you were able to keep your front wheel on the ground.
I had been an apostle of low gears as soon as I figured out how to put them on my road bikes back in the 1950s. I simply found that I was going to get my butt up the hill. I did it better spinning in a low gear than shoving in a high gear.
So we were converting from the 1-speed to the 5-speed.
You know, when Gary Fisher started putting 10 speeds on here, we thought, what the hell's the point? Who wants to pedal a bike uphill? The fun's going downhill.
In some ways, we were very, very conservative. You know, that's part of like what probably put the thing over the top, because there was a degree of respect for tradition. And yet at the same time, there was no respect.
Over the next few years, the Marin riders continued to add parts to their clunkers and define the Marin style. But by 1977, they'd exhausted the possibilities of a 40-year-old frame. The time had come to make the leap into purpose-built machines.
The relationship of clunkers to mountain bikes is like primates to humans. They're not the same, but they are related. So there was a real definitive point where people decided, yeah, let's actually produce something that's lighter, stronger, and made for going off-road.
We would put lighter and lighter parts on these old frames, making the bike lighter and lighter, but you could only go to a point because it had this monster of a frame as its root, and they just kept busting. And so we got tired of fixing these frames.
In 1977, this guy, Craig Mitchell, he was into making experimental bikes. He made recumbents and weird bikes.
He basically designed his frames using, he chose the angles and the wheelbase using numerology, so you can kind of imagine what some of them rode like. But
didn't care to make traditional bikes, and I asked him if he would make me copy the Excelsior, but do it with lightweight chromoly, because I was looking for the secret weapon. Hey, everybody was. And he did. He made the frame, but it didn't perform like I expected it to. But it did represent the first custom-made mountain bike frame. And
he's got to be put in the Hall of Fame someday soon, because he deserves to be there.
When I decided I didn't want that frame, I talked to Joe Breeze.
I was a frame builder from 1974. I learned how to build frames.
Joe took a course from a guy named Albert Eisentraut, who was a local frame builder. In fact, built the frame that Joe and I used, a tandem frame for the first cross-country trip. And Joe took a class from him on frame building.
And after a while, people were saying, "Hey, Joe, why don't you build some frames? You're building road frames. How about some of these fat tire frames?" And I kind of think about it. Yeah, it probably is possible to make a better bike.
I said, "Joe, what would it take to talk you into making a clunker frame?" He said, "Well, I don't know, probably, I think $200 or $300 on the spot. Here's $300, Joe." And Joe is great. You give Joe money, he's obliged. Joe is the most honest guy in the world. Once he had my money, I knew it was a done deal.
And up till then, everyone had just cannibalized old Schwinn frames and stuff. So the idea of having a custom-made bike.
Took him 8 months. He had to design this, from the ground up. There was no history. A mountain bike maker today has a lot of history he can draw from. A road bike maker has even more. There was no tradition. He had to work. He spent 2 or 3 months on the drawing board before he welded anything,
My father was a machinist, and so for most of my childhood, whenever we saw a bicycle, he'd be analyzing it and critiquing it for me. He would be teaching me about fine design of vehicles and machinery.
Joe had a lathe and had a mill, had all this stuff. He'd been seeing this stuff, since childhood.
So Joe kind of grew up in that heritage, so he was going to get these jigs and align the things and solder them or weld them, whatever you do, and make these bikes out of new tubing.
If you had to say somebody invented the mountain bike, it would definitely be Joe. Joe built the first, mountain bike frame meant for mountain biking with all new parts on it.
He made one for himself, and then I got the second one. And by then, of course, several of the other people around had ordered bikes because they saw what he was doing. And so he made 10. And he had the first one, I got the second one. So I had 2 of the first 3 custom mountain bikes ever.
I said, okay, well, I'll build 10 frames and we'll see how it goes. And I figured, okay, this is a whole new thing. These bikes, they need to be longer than a road racing bike, and added these twin laterals that went from the head tube to the rear dropouts to really set them apart. But the idea was to make them a little bit more rigid because the frames were so long. And built up my first off-road frame in October 1977, and rode it at Repack. Actually won the race. First race, first victory on the bike, and people just started calling them breezers. My last name is Breeze, and they tacked an R on it.
One of the first 10 breezers was built, for me.
I happened to be one of the recipients of one of them.
And an interest of ours was really in the self-sufficiency of bicycles. It wasn't just about somehow getting to the top of a mountain and blasting down it. It had to do with riding over hill and dale and being sufficient. And my thought with these bikes is that, yes, they would get you not only into the woods, but back out of the woods. And so the first 10 breezers that were sold fully equipped with a pump, a water bottle and cage, and a spare inner tube and tire irons, and even a handkerchief wrapped around it with a toe strap so they could fit underneath the saddle. So they were ready to go right out of the box.
And Joe Breeze, when he made his first 10 bikes for $750, that was an amazing statement that all of them sold well before he finished it, that they were all gone, and he had demand for more.
Just out on the street, these same road cycling friends would look at it with a whole new view in their head. I could tell. It was like, wow, that's really a bike.
They were the best.
It was way ahead of its time.
They were actually nickel-plated, and there was all shiny new parts, and very different from what they were before, and they were a lot lighter, too.
After 5 years of throwing all the bikes and trucks, all the paint was chipped, and the nickel-plated bikes looked perfect.
This was the first time you had a shiny new off-road bike, and it really turned heads.
But Gary didn't get in on the original batch.
I wanted to do it my way, his bikes are beautiful and everything, but I had my way of doing it too. I definitely wanted to do it my way.
So Gary turned to a fellow road racer who would also make the switch to building mountain bike frames.
One of our road racing buddies was a guy named Tom Ritchie, who also started building frames, and Tom was a fantastic bike racer.
I knew Tom Ritchie in the 70s when he was a junior, and he was a hot junior. Oh my God, he was good. He used to ride with the seniors all the time, and he was known as the senior slayer. He was just this punk kid that was just totally unbeatable. And he started building frames.
Tommy's a very prolific frame builder, very, known for being extremely fast and extremely good frame builder.
When I conceptualized something, it was the next day. I said, Joe, I think I'm going to build a bike. Well, I was thinking maybe tomorrow, in those terms. So I don't know how fast it happened, but it was like very fast. And Joe, from my recollection, had a conversation with Gary Fisher, and who I also knew from racing.
I told him that Gary Fisher was interested in finding somebody to build him some frames.
I got a call from Gary.
And I thought, man, this has got to be the guy that could build a frame for me.
And Gary said, hey, if you're going to build a bike, he was, I think, anticipating Joe building one for him, and he didn't know how long that would take, but he said, if you're going to build one for me. And I thought to myself, shoot, there's an order, okay.
I said, this is the geometry I want, this is the clearances I want, this is the sort of tubing I want. I want an open frame and everything. Anyway, he produced 3 frames in 4 weeks. This was hot.
They probably took me all total of, maybe a week at the most to build.
They were beautiful. Tom is an incredibly skilled frame builder, a great designer, really knows his stuff. He's great.
Meanwhile, elsewhere in Marin, other craftsmen were experimenting with unconventional designs and materials.
One of the guys that totally blew my mind was Charlie Cunningham. And Charlie was an aeronautical engineer at Berkeley, and he would come up with some weird little gadget that solved some problem. And it was always so funky. It would be wired on or glued, but it all had a purpose.
What really kind of made this start to happen, I think, was when the first aluminum rims became available for these fat tires. So I did some research and decided to use aluminum tubing.
He was the guy who really started out building mountain bike frames in aluminum, and at a time where you really didn't see aluminum bikes in the U.S. bike market either.
I was sort of trying to promote the idea of, well, let's not be constrained by tradition.
So he was kind of ahead of the curve as far as using different materials and, designing components that were different.
I wasn't an athlete, but I was going faster than a lot of these athletes just because the bikes were so light, so efficient. And they saw that, these guys that were the real kind of hardcore riders out there. And so I got 2 orders. Lo and behold, you can make money doing this, and you make people happy.
Back in the early 80s, Mark Slade and Charlie Cunningham, we were the original founders of Wilderness Trail Bikes, and it was sort of our love for bikes.
It was a really amazing thing to be able to be doing something that you enjoyed so much and make a living doing it. It was way cool.
Now that the Marin crew had the first truly custom-built bikes, it was only natural that they put them to the ultimate test.
One day I got a call from Charlie. Charlie said, hey, we're going to Crested Butte. I knew exactly what he meant because there was this article and we'd all read it and everything. We're all wondering about it.
The first article that appeared about mountain bikes and appeared in a publication called the Coevolution Quarterly.
To do a story on what we're doing with these fat tire bikes in Marin. And he told us about people in Crested Butte, Colorado doing a very similar thing. So we gave him a call. And it turns out that in 1976, they had ridden their bikes from Crested Butte over the 12,700-foot Pearl Pass dirt road into Aspen, and they were planning to have it be an annual event. And so we thought, well, we have to get hold of these guys. They're doing a very similar thing out there in Colorado.
And we thought, well, hey, there's other people like us, not realizing they were not at all like us.
It was a mining town, and it was, there were hardcores there. Oh.
These guys who first started this Pearl Pass ride, they weren't cyclists. They were seasonal firefighters and spent a lot of time down at the old grub stake there, tilting a few.
And their idea of training was staying up, late at night and doing like this. Oh, drink.
They were not bike riders. They were drinkers who had bikes.
There weren't many real athletes, so to speak. In fact, they accused us of being cheating because we were athletes.
Well, I guess there was 6 of us from Marin, drove on out there.
And we said, hey, are you guys going to do your big ride? And they said, oh, sure, we're going to do that. Well, in fact, they weren't.
They were kind of surprised to see us. They didn't think we'd really make it out there. And there we were with our bikes ready to go. And we said, okay, so we're here for the event. You're going to be doing it, right?
And at that point, they realized that, man, these guys came 1,000 miles. Look at their fancy bikes.
They weren't too serious about it. So when we pulled into town with all our, state-of-the-art, high-tech equipment bikes, they were totally blown away.
And they were like looking at each other going, is she doing it? As they point to Wendy Craig, and Wendy says, yep, I'm doing it. And says, okay, we're doing it too. I think the machismo kicked in,
So over a period of 3 or 4 days, they whipped their machinery into shape with massive help from me and Gary and Joe. I mean, we were building wheels and fixing bikes and doing everything we could for them.
And they spent the night before in the bar, and then they were just so beat up the next morning. I'm surprised any of them even made it up to the base camp.
It was mostly just a drunken party that kind of had bikes involved, but wasn't really focused on them.
And they were tough. I mean, oh my God. We'd start riding, and they'd throw up, and they'd get back on their bike, and they'd keep riding.
It was pretty intense, getting up past the timber line.
It was shocking to the system. I mean, here we were sea-level riders and everything, and at over 10,000 feet, your body goes into this thing of like, you either can take it or not.
We went over Pearl Pass, which I think is about 12,000 feet.
We're all outdoors people, We could all take it, and we were tough, and Wendy was tough, and we all made it. And so there was a Crested Butte to Aspen Pearl Pass Klunkerz tour that year. This was part of the whole process, These bikes really did need to be tested and see if they really worked.
And 13 of us went over Pearl Pass to Aspen, and it was maybe another milestone because it actually linked 2 parts of the country on the same concept.
And in fact, it really kicked it off for many years to come, and every year it grew and grew by leaps and bounds until there were hundreds of people doing this ride.
And all they needed was the impetus.
Regional pollination of the western states had begun. As Crested Butte transformed into a mountain biking destination, the Marin riders and their bikes received national attention.
Some producers in San Francisco with KPIX, they had their evening magazine show. Steve Fox came out to do a segment in January of 1979.
And of course we had a great turnout because everybody knew they'd be on TV.
And did a bang-up job. It's a great, 10-minute, 15-minute clip. It aired across the country eventually, I think with the CBS affiliates. And that's when a whole lot of people got a taste of what we're doing in Marin County. And I'm sure there were plenty of people who had ridden these off-road bikes earlier in their lives for a summer or two, maybe out to the fishing hole, maybe down some local mountain, and saw that footage on TV and thought, wow, we used to do that. That sure is fun. Let's do it some more. And that's really what catalyzed mountain biking in the nation.
The genie was out of the bottle. As word of the mountain bike spread across the country, the demand for bikes grew. The laid-back athletes of Marin had to make the move from hippie to entrepreneur literally overnight.
Nobody had any idea that it would grow into what it grew into. We just did it because it was fun. It was just fun. I mean, there was no two ways about it.
So we went on about our business, and Gary's got a nice new bike, and we're all happy. And so I was hanging around in Fairfax one day, and Gary shows up, and he says, hey, man, Tom made 9 more of these bikes. And he opens the trunk of his car, and there they are. They're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful, beautiful workmanship. He said, man, you want to help me get rid of these things?
Charlie, we've been talking about this for a long time. Let's do something. And my racing thing was sort of like coming into an end in a way. Time to move on to the next thing. And we started a company right on that day. We called it Mountain Bikes.
We literally pulled out our wallets. We had a couple of $100 between us. Took it to the bank and opened a checking account and said, okay, we're in business now.
And in '79, they formed what was the first mountain bike specific business.
I wanted to make a company out of this thing, and I wanted to spread it all around the world.
And the business was badly run from that minute on. Because really, getting into business by default is not really the way you want to approach things. But because we were in the hole to Tom Ritchie, as soon as we said, yeah, we'll sell these frames. Okay, now we owe him for those frames, right?
He was the biggest supplier. He was the one that really came through. Tom could produce 50 frames in 3 weeks.
Tom was, we used to call him General Motors, because, he'd just crank out the bikes, but, beautiful bikes. A true artist, the best of the best.
Little by little, I became less of a road builder and more of a mountain bike builder. And even today, in the mountain bike circles, people are surprised. Oh, you built road bikes before you built mountain bikes. Yeah, I built not only road bikes, but I built hundreds and hundreds of them. And probably by 1979, I'd built at least 1,000 road bikes.
All of a sudden, here he can make these things. He can make them just as fast as road bikes, but he didn't have to worry about sizes. He's small, medium, large. People were like eating them up. And so for Tom, it was like, this is perfect. And Tom's very prolific, and he was just building frames like crazy for Gary.
My first real production frame was a Ritchie, and my second one was a Ritchie, and my third one was a Ritchie, and my fourth one was a Ritchie, and my fifth one was a Fisher.
And we bought all the equipment, that is all the parts and bits and pieces on the bike.
In order to get a bike from us, you had to pay us up front, a couple of crazed hippies. And then you had to wait a month or so because it's not like we had all the parts. We had to take your money, go to the bike shop, buy the stuff, go home, build wheels, assemble bike, present it to you, and we've already spent actually most of your money, getting you the bike, and now we got to give Tom some.
And they were figuring out how to receive the orders, order the parts, and build the bikes. So I would deliver them the frame and the fork painted. The customer would order the bike with a certain size and color, and I would deliver them that way. And so they became an importing business and a distributor business and an assembly shop.
Nothing was on the market. Now, you want the parts for a mountain bike, you call up some company and they'll send it. It'll all come neat in a box. It'll all fit. We had to order everything from a different company, different supplier. Some guys only sell you 50 of something. Some guys will sell you one. You're juggling your supply and demand. Pretty much everything that you get out of the box, you got to do something to. You got to file it or bend it or make it fit somehow.
And we did all the advertising, and we did all the marketing. We did all the packaging and the sales, and we collect the money.
There was no science to it. We were making it up as we went along.
And so when I went on the road in 1980, I asked these guys if they'd like me to represent them and sell the bike. And they said, well, we don't have any money, James, but if you want to do it, sure. I said, well, I'll do it. When you guys start making money, you can pay me a commission. How's that sound? So I started to give out literature, all the stops I went to all the shops, and showed them my bike. Most bike shops had never seen a mountain bike in 1980, even in California.
In the first year that we did business, we sold, about 160 bikes. The second year, we sold about 1,000. We had people lined up out the door, and people could not help but notice. Here are these two crazy hippies, man, that just don't, are their own worst enemies, and they just can't stop doing landmark business.
Like I say, we're winging it from day one, and it's not like any of us had run a complex business before, and that's why our business kind of fell apart later on. But at that time, it didn't matter how bad a businessman you were. You had something that the demand was so high and the supply was so limited that even our ineptitude couldn't stop us.
We were all so young, naive, unaware of what we were capable of, skilled-wise. We didn't have any serious business background. I didn't go to school beyond high school, didn't have, either marketing or a business management expertise. And, it just, infected us all in a good and a very challenging personal way.
When Gary and Charlie started out with mountain bikes, they talked to a fellow we all knew, John Finley Scott, a sociology professor from UC Davis.
It was John Finley Scott, who is the first big investor in mountain bikes.
John had a lot of experience with off-road bikes. He had actually made a fat tire bike back in the early 50s, 1953, I believe. He called it a woodsy bike when he was going to Reed College up near Portland.
John Scott had, in fact, done everything that we did. He did it 20 years earlier.
I think his was just a 3-speed version of it, but still it had the balloon tire, and he understood the thrill that those big tires could give you out riding on the trail.
And because the times were not right for what he was doing, it just stopped right there. It was a dead end. He was the only guy. And that's why he liked us, come on. He saw himself in us.
So he invested in mountain bikes pretty early on.
I certainly got to know Gary Fisher once he got into mountain bikes for a very interesting practical reason. First, his facility was interesting, both the distinctive sociology of the mountain bike types that hung out in that corner of the world, and second, his business.
You know, it started very informally, and it was informal, and that was one of the problems is how informal it was, because then when the business mindset kicked in, you know, there was other issues.
Gary Fisher was a very good example of a hippie capitalist. That is to say, if you gave him a situation, as he created for himself, where he suddenly had to become a businessman, he turned his brain on and became a very capable businessman indeed.
We did well. We liked to make money.
He simply had more marketing sense than everybody else, and the entire bicycle industry in the United States benefits from that because his competitors had to catch on to what he was doing to stay in business.
When businesses and people grow to a level of, you know, territory and turf and, you know, this is mine and this is yours.
I had a decal made for frames. It said Ritchie/Mountain Bikes. Two separate companies. People didn't realize this, though. They thought it was one company, Ritchie Mountain Bikes. Marketing mistake 101, you know. I started marketing somebody that, a name that I had no possession of. You know, I didn't own Ritchie. Ritchie owned Ritchie.
You have to start, you know, wondering, you know, if it's worth doing business together.
Well, in 1983, the consequences of running a business by the seat of your pants were really catching up to me and Gary.
Charlie is a nice guy, a philosopher, but he's not a disciplined businessman the way Gary turned out to be.
And finally it was like, well, I got to take the walk around the block with Charlie and, you know, and talk to him about all this. And it was, you know, hey, we can't do this together. We got to separate. And we did.
So I allowed Gary to buy me out of the business, and I really didn't take too much for it because the business was really deeply in debt.
And I didn't like what happened. I didn't like the whole process. Going into business and everything is really hard.
At the same time, the market was exploding. You know, the market was there, the business was crumbling. And at the same time, I was just really burned out with it. And I, you know, left the business, and it became Gary Fisher's Mountain Bikes, and now then Gary Fisher Bikes, because he stopped using Ritchie for a supplier, started having his bike mass-produced in the Orient, like everybody else who wants to make money. Because really, a guy who's making them in his garage is not going to keep up with the country of China, you know, and the demand was at that point big enough, so mass-produced bikes were really a good idea.
You know, by 1983, we were influencing Shimano, Suntour, tire makers, rim makers. We were pretty much dictating standards to these companies, and they were over here, you know, using us. And we didn't really think of it in terms of using each other, but that's really what was going on.
We had the ear of actually people that matter instead of just being, you know, some dope-smoking hippies that don't even ride regular bicycles. We were more industry connected. We were part, in a sense, I guess, of mainstream cycling in a way.
One of the things that I wanted to continue to do is I wanted to continue to develop standards, components, and what Gary wanted to do is develop volume bikes. That was a conflict, is him wanting to develop production bikes in Asia and my wanting to stay with the high quality hand-built bikes and develop more of the component business. So when we split, that's basically the paths we took.
And as time went on, of course, mountain bike-specific components were put into production principally by the Japanese and principally through the big marketing presence of Mike Sinyard of Specialized Bicycle Components.
I had the parts that other people didn't have, or they didn't understand, or they didn't want to fool with all the different cogs and all that stuff.
Mike Sinyard, good friend, good guy, really respect him. Mike, I used to buy parts from. Every now and again, Mike would say, I want a bike. Can you get me a bike? I said, sure. Sure, Mike. I can get you a bike. I'd bring him a bike. What's Mike gonna do with the bike? Mike's gonna ride the bike. Yeah, Mike's gonna ride the bike. Mike said, I rode the bike. The bike's great. I love it. I love it. What's Mike gonna do? Mike's gonna make a bike himself one of these days. Yeah, he will.
And Specialized Bicycles, you know, took one of Tom's bikes and took it overseas in Japan and basically had a copy of it made and then brought to the show as the Stump Jumper.
The most favorite, of course, is the Stump Jumper. Here's like a 1981 here. And the great thing about this bike is it was a totally international bike, you know, with the crankset coming from TA from France. You could have any gears you want on this bike, you know. Brake levers from Italy. They came from a real famous motorcycle company, Tomaselli. But they were like really stout, and they had the motorcycle cable, so it was like, whoa. You put on the brakes, it was like, stop.
Here, all of a sudden, this bike that was basically a mass-produced Tom Ritchie.
There's no doubt that the first bike was definitely inspired by Tom. And I would say that Tom, even to this day, is probably one of the very best craftsmen in the world. I mean, there's no bones about it.
You know, at that time, what was going through my head is that, you know, it was a territorial thing, but I thought to myself, how can they build a good quality bike in Japan? You know, these are junky bikes, and you know, we don't have anything to worry about.
I think initially when we kind of did the promotion and, you know, talked about, you know, the mountain bike as a whole new sport and things, I think initially some people were jealous and saying, hey, well, that's our deal, you know, and my whole thing was, hey, let's open up the tent and let everybody in. You know, this is such a big tent. You know, it's the world. It's not this little tent, it's this big thing.
Now it's on, and now everybody's coming into it. Shimano's making, you know, better parts.
And the more conservative Europeans eventually got in the act themselves, but mainly after the Japanese had become the market leaders in off-road components and in many respects off-road bikes themselves.
The Stump Jumper Sport mountain bike, double page spread in the front of the Sharper Image catalog. And then all of a sudden we were being published in magazines like New York Magazine and Newsweek International. And at that point, all of a sudden the media was aware of it. And then it took off.
In terms of marketing smarts for bicycles and bicycle components, he was ahead of any other 5 people I can think of. His only possible rival, in my judgment, certainly on the West Coast, was Gary Fisher himself, who limited his innovations to mountain bikes.
For sure, we learned a lot from the custom builders, from some of these guys like Tom, there's no doubt. You know, as we went forward, they learned a lot from us as well.
But it certainly brought many, many, many more people onto the mountain bike.
At that point, the whole bike industry jumped on board. The rest is history, as they said. It became the major part of the industry.
And the thing I love about the mountain bike is how it brought everybody into cycling. I mean, I think that's so magical.
By 1986, basically, the mountain bike was outselling the road bike in the United States.
In the end, I think that's how everybody feels about it. It's like, you know, we're able to make a life doing the things that we love and trying some things that are different. It's awesome.
And from that, it went around the world. In Europe, it's huge now.
Since those early days, mountain biking has become a healthy activity for hundreds of millions of people around the world.
I think we're going to see a lot more from the mountain bike in the future.
I'm sure there's lots of things still to think of, you know.
Evolution hasn't stopped. No telling where it can go.
But where are the Marin riders now? And whatever happened to the Morrow Dirt Club?
The 20-year disappearance from the bicycling scene of the Morrow Dirt Club was a planned disappearance. None of the riders ever had the slightest inkling that we were pioneers. What we were doing, it seemed obvious. The fact that Marin may not have picked it up immediately seemed inconsequential. We had our bikes, we were doing our thing, we were happy. Time went by, I had Super 8mm films, a lot of pictures, and always planned to come out of the closet in some kind of archival way to represent the contribution of myself and my friends. We ran into a contractor on a concrete job I was working on who lived in Occidental, the same town as Tom Ritchie, and they rode bicycles together and worked out and were buddies.
I had a project up in Sonoma County, and my contractor said, hey, you know, I've got this guy that worked for me, and he said that he did that stuff before any of you guys.
And he suspected that I might have been one of the first people to put a derailleur and transmission on a balloon tire bike.
I was thinking, okay, you know, prove it. You know, kind of like, well, if he's got some proof, I'd be interested in seeing it.
And so I had the opportunity to send some graphics to Ritchie.
And I look at it and I go, whoa, this is the real deal. I called Joe and I said, Joe, this is what happened. And Joe goes, golly, I've been looking for those guys for 20 years. They're the missing link, you know?
They were quite pleased that the Morrow DC was still living and had an address.
And so it was Joe and Tom who helped get the Morrow Dirt Club the recognition they deserved.
I'll tell you, Breeze and Richie put the squeeze on the Hall of Fame. These guys are in.
That was great. Yeah. A little recognition of just the past and a little
your
recognition
contribution to it and stuff. This is the most fantastic, wonderful experience, kind of a gratification, and almost made sense out of disappearing for 20 years.
It's been a long, strange trip for the Marin Riders, but their love of the noblest invention remains as strong as ever.
We saw this vision of cycling in America, and that was so important to a lot of the key players in the early mountain biking days, and still is today.
I'm just an evangelist for cycling. I want to tell people about it.
This is not just kind of something we're doing on the side. This is kind of part of our passion in life.
We built them because they were fun. I mean, I actually think that's one of the magical things that made it so special and made it what it is today, is that I think if any of us came at it from a business thing, well, let's create a new sport. Let's make these bikes and try to sell them. I mean, that's just not how it happened.
It's the easiest way still to carve out a space of your own in a very, very, fast-paced world.
It's a great way to empower ourselves and be green, basically, not trash the planet so badly.
In the end, it's getting people to be healthier, getting people to be thinking more about the environment, getting people to ride their bicycles in a better way.
Cycling is, this beautiful connector between what you need to do, what you have to do, and just going out and having fun.
My buddy Gary and I, we had this huge adventure, and we didn't even realize while we were having it what an adventure it was. And when you share an adventure like that with some guys, it's pretty much a forever thing. It just, sometimes it takes a while to digest how forever it is,
Across the board, everybody was collaborating with each other. There was not rivalry and there was not enmity or jealousy or anything like that. It was just like, we were all friends and to lesser or greater degrees, but we were all friends.
Yeah, we shared everything, and I don't know, maybe I would have done it different if I thought about it, but nobody was thinking about it. Everybody's just like doing what they do,
It just humbles you, and just realizing, how lucky, you've been to be able to grow up in this way.